our application now has two pieces of state, the email and the password. So in theory, once the user enters these, we're ready to actually sign them into our application. So the next thing we need to work on is figuring out how do we actually sign in a user, right? Well, as we figured out in the past, we use Firebase to authenticate our user. But thinking about authentication, right, just kind of thinking about it in general, I'm starting to think that maybe our auth reducer is going to need to maintain a couple other properties in here beyond just email and password. So let's check out a mockup. On the left-hand side is what our state currently is, like what it looks like when we run our application. We have just email and password, nothing else, that's it. What I'm going to propose for our application state, what I'm going to propose our auth reducer comes into responsibility for is a loading flag, an error message, and a user model. So let's talk about each of these really quick. We already know what the email and password are. Those are just the strings that the user is entering. How about the loading flag here? This loading flag is going to be just like the one that we previously had. It's going to be a Boolean, either true or false, and it's just going to record whether or not we are currently trying to authenticate the user. So the purpose of loading right here is just so we can show a spinner. That's it, nothing crazy. The error flag, again, is a string. It's going to record whether or not there was an error in authentication. So just a string, it's going to say something like authentication failed or whatever we feel like giving a message. Now the last one is a little bit more interesting, user. So user here is going to be the user model that is supplied by Firebase. So we'll learn a lot more about this in just a little bit. For right now, just take my word for it that this user property is going to be an object that tells us stuff like, here's what the currently signed in user's username and ID is. So it's just a short description. It's an object. It's a short description of our user who is signed in. So all in all, I am suggesting that we expand the properties of our reducer, the properties that our reducer makes by adding in these last three on here. Okay, that is what I'm suggesting that we do. So of course, because we want to update our application state, we're going to need to toss in some action creators and types and all that other good stuff to manage these properties, right? So we can like actually change the loading flag and error flag and user, like all that kind of good stuff. So now that we know what the properties we want to maintain are, we can start to think about when we want to update each of them. Okay, I want to think about when we're going to update each of those flags. So the email and password we've already done, and those two they're kind of obvious, right? Whenever a user types something in the email field, I want to update my email. Whenever the user types something in the password field, I want to update my password piece of state. But these new three down here, well, they're a little bit different, aren't they? They're a little bit different. The loading flag will probably start off as something like null or false, because by default, when the user first starts the application up, yeah, we're not actually loading anything just yet. So probably start as false or whatever. But once an authentication request starts, we're going to flip it over to true. And then very importantly, this is like what I'm trying to hammer in here, what I'm trying to get at, is when the request is complete, when like the sign-in request is complete, we're going to flip it back to false. Okay, so when the request is complete, I want to change this value of this piece of state right here. Same thing with the error message. By default, it's going to be an empty string, but when the authentication request is complete, I want to get an error message and maybe update this to show the user an error message. And the same with a third one here as well. By default, it might be like null to say, hey, no user is signed in right now. But when the authentication request is complete, I want to put the user model in there as this property. So the common theme here, the goal with these last three properties, is that after we make a request to the Firebase server, we want to update our application state. Okay, that is the goal. But no problem with that, right? Like, we know how to update our application state. We make an action creator, and we return an action, and then our reducer updates something. Like, whatever. What's the big deal here? Well, maybe it's not so simple. I want to point out some little issue here. So first, just to make sure everything is crystal clear about this kind of setup, this prep I'm trying to do here, I want to just be very clear, very direct with you. Whenever a user presses that login button right there, when they press it, we're going to call something like a login user action creator with the email and password. And that action creator is going to make a request to sign the user in, or like to log them in. Now, again, the part that I'm trying to make real crystal clear right here is that this action creator must, by definition, be making an AJAX request, right? So it's going to make an AJAX request, and until that request succeeds or fails, until it completes, we don't really know what action we want to return from that action creator. And that's what I'm really trying to get here. So I'm really trying to get at. By default, whenever we are, as all the action creators we've created so far behave, when we call an action creator, it runs, we return an action. Boom, here's the action. We call it, runs it, get the action back, toss it off to the reducer. Instantaneous, no delay whatsoever. But with this new idea, this new request that I want to make, things behave a little bit differently. When we call the action creator, it runs, we make a request to Firebase, and hey, wait a minute, we don't actually have anything to return yet. Remember, AJAX requests are asynchronous. So inside that action creator, we have no value, no action to return. Nothing to say like, hey, here's the user. The user is going to come in a minute. Just hold on. Don't actually return an action yet. We don't know what it is yet. Only at some time in the future, when the request is complete, can we actually return an action. That is what I'm trying to get at here. So when we have action creators that make AJAX requests, things behave a little bit differently, and our existing pattern of call the action creator, return an action starts to break down. Because when we make an AJAX request, we don't immediately have anything to return from this function. And remember, in JavaScript, there is no such thing as sleep or wait or anything like that. When this action creator runs, it's going to execute the code inside of it and then immediately return. And there is nothing you can do to stop that. So there's no fancy way that we can somehow say, oh, make AJAX requests, right up here. But don't return anything just yet. Just give me a minute to figure out what this value should be. So clearly, our existing pattern for action creators is not going to work when it comes to making AJAX requests. Clearly, we need some new methodology here. Okay? We need some new way of handling action creators that's going to help us to make an AJAX request and then at some point in the future, maybe dispatch an action to say, loading is complete, here's the error message if there is one, and here's the user if there is one. Okay, so one last time, just to condense this all down to a single sentence, give you the summary. The big problem here is that we've been writing synchronous action creators that instantly return an action, but we need to be able to write an asynchronous action creator that will return an action at some point in the future. So of course, this is not an original problem. I didn't just kind of stumble across this. Redux has our back on this one. Let's discuss how we're going to solve this in the next section.